Welcome to Epic Begins with One Step Forward, the podcast that reveals how to plan, achieve, and enjoy the journey of creating epic results in your life, business, health, and relationships. Here's your host, best-selling author and motivational speaker, Xander Sprague.
Welcome, epic people, to Epic Begins with One Step Forward. I'm your host, Xander Sprague, and I am so excited today to have David Chotka join me. We're going to have a very interesting conversation today. In fact, I would say be epic. So, David, take a moment and introduce yourself.
Well, let me congratulate you on pronouncing my name correctly. So you and I have both had the same struggle. In my hometown, people would call me Chakota or Choctaw. I actually had one time where I was working with a bunch of Presbyterians and they thought I was a Choctaw Indian because the Presbyterian mission went to the Choctaws. So there you go. But it's nothing to do with that at all. I'm just thankful to be here. And I'm a pastor and I've written 5 books. I have 3 of them here on display. And I travel. I do international conferences and events, and I'm just thankful to be here.
Well, that's great. I'm so excited. And I wanted to, this may have some meaning to you, but for me, when I talk about epic, I got thinking about, well, what does EPIC mean to me? And for me, epic, I'll go back a second and just say, I think we all have epic things that we'd like to achieve in our life. And oftentimes we hear ourselves saying, oh, someday I'd like to write a book or run a marathon or travel to some country. And oftentimes we just talk about it, but we don't actually do anything about it. Well, I found in my own life that there were things I thought about doing, and even though they seemed wildly impossible from where I was, I tried anyway. And I achieved some amazing things, like writing a book. If you had told me in college that I would be a best-selling author, I would have told you that you were drinking too much of the sacrificial wine or something, right? Like, just, I'm a talker, not a typer.
Okay.
But when I think about epic and what does epic stand for me, epic stands for every pilgrimage includes commitment. Because I think when we want to go out and achieve this really big thing in our life, it is indeed a pilgrimage. And for me, it's I know in religion, pilgrimage has a very specific meaning. For me, it's less of it, but I think in general, we all get what pilgrimage. But for you, what is some of your epic?
Well, I have a lot of them, actually. So the first one was that I'd become a pastor and there was no faith in my family. Then I became a pastor. And actually, I'm in the midst of writing 2 more books. I've written 4. Well, 4.5, I guess. I have a little pamphlet as well. I guess you could call that 5. But that was published inside the framework of my denomination, so it doesn't have the same kind of thing. Sure. But to become a bestseller was one of my objectives. And this one here, Hey, Are You There to Speak God, has a foreword by Jack Canfield on it.
Nice.
This old guy. And as a result, it was a Canadian bestseller for, I'm a Canadian, by the way. And so if I say A at the end of my sentence, you'll forgive me. At any rate, he liked the book. What happened was I enrolled in a course with him to try and learn how to do storyteller writing because he's masterful at it.
Very much so.
Yeah. 600 million copy of his books, the Chicken Soup book. So yeah. I think you should pay attention when the guy tells you that you should improve that or fix this or something.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I enrolled with this course with him. It was 17 students. And I had this crazy kind of thing. I wanted him to write the foreword to my book. And he fell in love with 2 of the stories in that book, 2 of them. And I'd like to tell you one of those stories if you'd let me do that.
Absolutely.
I'll tell you about the moment where I realized I wanted to ask him something. So I'm working with this company. It's called Bradley Communications. And oh, by the way, they're very good at what they do. And they're teaching me about the power of story. They're teaching me about marketing. They're teaching me about social media. And I stepped out into this role in my 60s. Maybe you don't think I'm in my 60s, but I am. Anyway, backing up on this guy says to me, he wants to, I talked to them and they said, he doesn't do forewords to books anymore. He stopped doing that about 20 years ago. And I was writing the last story in that book, sitting on my computer at night. And I'm in Ontario, and California, where he lives, is 3 hours earlier in the day.
It is.
And I'm sitting in front of my computer, and I get this profound sense that I'm supposed to ask Jack Canfield if he'd do the forward for my book. Well, he'd done an interview with me, and so I wrote him, and he said he would do an endorsement. An endorsement's 3 lines.
Mhm.
Forward is like 2 pages. Anyway.
Yep.
So he said, well, look, for the endorsement, just take something I said in the interview and put it into a thing, and then send it to me to make sure that I can agree with it.
Mhm.
So I wrote it, and it turned into 2 pages. So I'm sitting in this office right here at this desk, and I pray, and I said, well, God, what should I do? I was told that he won't do that anymore. And as I prayed, I had an interior sense of joy rise up inside of me. And so I wrote him a note, and it was at 1 o'clock in the morning, Ontario time, 10 o'clock in the evening in California. And I thought, well, he's not going to see this. And so I sent this little note. I said, dear Jack, you said these things in this interview. Isn't this nice? I wonder if you'd prayerfully consider turning this into a forward rather than just an endorsement. And I pressed send. 5 minutes later, I had it back, and he signed it.
Yeah, that's great. That's awesome.
So well, it was the first one he did in a long, long, long time. And now he started to write forwards again.
Oh, cool.
But yeah, so that's an amazing thing. But the story he fell in love with was the very first story in that book. So here's how it goes. I was a pastor in northern Alberta, and for those who live in the United States and don't know what I'm talking about, if you drive to the Montana border and get to the Canadian Montana border, and then you get in your car and you drive straight north for 8 hours at 60 miles an hour and don't stop for coffee or the call of nature, anything like that, you'll come to Edmonton, and just to the side of Edmonton is a city called Spruce Grove, and I lived in that city for about 10 years, pastored a church there. And here's what happened. There was one night where my daughter, she always had milk for her breakfast, always had milk on her Cheerios, and she wouldn't eat her Cheerios unless she had milk.
Yeah.
So I made the bad mistake at about, 20 minutes to 10 at night, something like that, of using up the last of the milk. And as I poured it into my coffee, my daughter doesn't have milk for her breakfast. Oh, the grocery store, 10 minutes away. It's open until 10 o'clock. I'll jump in the car. I'll get the milk. So I told my wife I'd do this. And I get in the car. Now, I'm in a church that sings these modern yeah, yeah, yeah kind of songs, right? They repeat Jesus, I love you. And it sounds like a converted bar singer.
Sure.
And I like the old stuff where people thought when they sang.
Mm-hmm.
So I get in the car, I close the door, I turn the radio on, and on comes my favorite old-time 19th century Irish Anglican hymn. And I'm listening to this hymn, and I am moved to my toenails because that hymn healed my soul 15 years before. Actually, we talked a little bit about the loss of my brother. My brother took his life, and that hymn was the hymn that healed my soul. And so I am in the car, and I'll tell you this, when nobody's looking at me, I'll sing at the top of my lungs. With the door closed, driving in the car, it's dark. I'm driving along, I'm singing this.
We all sing at the top of our lungs in our car, David. Let me tell you.
Well, it was so anyway.
Maybe not a 19th century Irish Anglican theme, but yes, absolutely. I think everyone listening's like, sure, I've been singing in the car.
Anyway, it was before the throne of God I stand. If anybody knows the song. So I'm driving around, and the song is just penetrating my being, and I'm so caught up with the beauty and the majesty of the lyrics and the music. I drive right past the grocery store.
Oh, no.
So I realized, I got to get milk for my daughter. And I turned the car around, and my dad had just passed. And he was a terrible singer, terrible. But he loved an old hymn, What a Friend We Have in Jesus. And that song came on. Of course, everybody knows that song.
Sure.
And I'm thinking about my dad, and I'm starting to cry because I'm missing my dad. He just passed. And I drive right past the grocery store again. By then, it's too late. It's already, 10 o'clock. And I thought, I'm just going to enjoy these hymns. I haven't sung these hymns in a long, long time. So I start driving around listening to these songs. And I was so moved by the experience of singing those songs. I thought, I'm going to have an accident. I want to close my eyes, and I want to listen to this music, and I wanted to penetrate my soul. So I pulled in somewhere, and I listened, and it was this beautiful song was ending, and I turned the car off as I just thought about it. And without thinking, I got out of the car, and I walked toward the door of a strange house, and I knocked on the door, and then came to myself and realized it was 10:15 at night. And I was banging on some stranger's door. I didn't even know whose house it was. And I don't know, we have a game up here called Nicky Nine Doors. It's where you knock on the door late at night and run away.
I believe that's we call, ring dash, or
Call it what you will. I was actually seriously thinking that I should do that.
Yeah.
And I heard sounds behind the door.
Mm-hmm.
And the door opens, and there is a couple that I know. They've been visiting my church. It was Tim and Sarah. And I'll tell you how I knew their name. Tim had tattoos from the top of his head all the way down to his fingernails. And he had these ear gauge expander earrings, and he looked like he was a biker guy who was going to hit you, right?
Yeah.
And he was married to this beautiful little church mouse, that she's cute little tiny lady, as sweet can be. And they really looked like an odd guy. They were new to the church, and I had a system of meeting people at the door, trying to remember their names.
Sure.
That kind of thing. So I knew he was Tim, and I knew she was Sarah. And so I see them, and they look at me, and they said, "Pastor Dave, you're here." I said, "Tim, Sarah, how you doing?" And then she gives him an enormous elbow, and she said, "You see, Tim, you see, it's true. It's true. God hears our prayers. God hears our prayers." And he starts to laugh, and then he starts to cry, and she starts to laugh, and she starts to cry. And they invite me in, and they sit me down. And here's what the background to the story was. Tim met the pretty Christian girl. He liked the pretty Christian girl, and he said, "I'd like to take you out." And she said, "Are you a Christian?" And she said, "No." And he said, "No." And she said, "Well, I won't date one, but if you want to come to church, you can sit with me." So anyway, he shows up. Of course, Dad's there, and she's there, and he has to sit, between Dad and this girl, right?
Yeah.
So he's
Always.
watch, right? And they invited him over for lunch, and in the course of time, over several weeks, he says yes to the claims of Christ. Eventually, they fall in love and they marry. But the trouble is, he brought his background with him. He had an enormous knife collection that would cover the whole room, just this long thing. And she was one of these sweet, nonviolent, kind of gentle, sweet girls who would always give you, peach cobbler if you were sick or something like this. Anyway, the point was they married, and they moved to my town because it was quite a bit cheaper to live in that city than it was in the center of Edmonton. And there were lots and lots and lots of young families, because it was about 80 to 100,000 bucks cheaper to buy the same house.
Sure.
And a 20-minute drive in. So lots of families were in that church, young families. Anyway, here's what happened. Tim's background followed him, and he and Sarah had this terrible fight about something that had to do with the background. And they started to say things that were hurting each other.
Sure.
And in the middle of the argument, while they were hurting each other, they both realized they were hurting each other, and they stopped. They asked each other's forgiveness. They hugged each other, and they hit the ground, and they started to pray. And they said, "Oh, God, we're in trouble. God, we're in trouble. We need help. Send Pastor David. Send him to our house. Send him now." And I show up, and I knock on the door.
Oh my, that's
amazing
awesome.
thing. And so I was actually the answer to their prayer. And so God directed me through distracting me with favorite music so that I wouldn't pay attention to what I was doing. And I got myself in a cloudy zone where all that I could do was think about the beauty and the majesty of those hymns, and then memory of my dad's passing. And so it became a side door to being with them. And then they went on and became great friends.
Oh,
and
that's awesome. That is such a great story, David.
Well, that's the story that Jack Canfield wanted to put into another Chicken Soup for the Soul book, but he stopped doing that. He's written a book called Success Principles, and he sold the rights to Chicken Soup to somebody else. But regardless of that, it bonded our friendship. So Jack and I talk every now and then.
Oh, well, that's great. No, I've actually gotten to meet Jack many years ago. I'm in the National Speakers Association, so
okay.
I was at a conference and got to meet him, and that was really great. So,
well, he likes stories like that.
He does. He does. And I've got lots of stories. Look, I too am a storyteller and stuff. So one thing that obviously you shared, we both lost siblings. And one of my experiences I remember was after my sister was killed. I was driving from my parents' house, and was just sort of all consumed with that. Why did this happen? It's not fair. And having that just constantly on my mind of wanting to understand why this had happened.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we all have those moments of clarity. We all define them differently, whether it's God speaking to you or a higher power or whatever. I'm not a very religious person. I don't want to say I'm not religious, but I'm, you know, I've got my own feeling that, hold on, I'm going on a tangent there. I'll come back to the
That's
tangent in
good.
just a second.
I
But
thought you talked
anyway,
about that.
anyway, I did. I had this moment of clarity on the Massachusetts Turnpike in Brighton, Mass, where I said, I will, while I am here on this mortal coil, I will never understand why this happened.
Yep.
And I need to let go of that because I could spend the rest of my life like a dog chasing its tail,
Yep.
and I won't have that answer. And I have to be okay that I don't have that answer. And I am, you know, it, it, I think about it, but I go, that's not something that I can know.
Right.
Right. And the tangent I was going to go off on was I've been around some people who are very enthusiastic about their religion, and oh, you've got to come to you've got to come to church, you got to come. And I've studied the Bible enough to go, look, God is everywhere. Oh yes, I said, and we know that in, I believe it's the Old Testament, it says that on the seventh day he rested.
Yes.
We also know that when God got mad at man, there were the plagues, the 7 plagues. So if God is everywhere, and we know what his wrath is, and he's resting, why am I disturbing him?
Well, no.
So
What
God
you
is
thinking
just as much in my bedroom as he is in that uncomfortable pew
Sure.
on Sunday morning. So that's my own, and I've shared that, and some people are like, no, I mean, you're bending it around. I'm like, I haven't bent anything. That's exactly what. I go, I haven't bent anything. You agreed with everything. Yes, that the Bible says this. Yes.
Well, I laughed. I didn't agree with everything.
Again.
No. That's
I
the
mean,
bottom line.
David, people. I think it's safe to say that religion will, Christians will take the Bible and say, well, this is what it's saying. Well, maybe not,
So,
but I don't
bottom line here,
want to get
listen.
into a huge.
No. I don't want you to go to church. I want you to be the church.
Yeah, exactly.
So the church that I'm in always says, Windsor Christian Fellowship, you have been equipped, now go be the church. And they send us out to meet people and to love on people and to care for people and to stand alongside people, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, I love the place because it's a multiracial place. We have a couple of opera singers on the platform, and the music is to die for. Oh man,
sure.
It's a good place to be. But I don't go there because I'm looking to participate in a church fellowship. I go there to encounter God, and in the process, I find myself in fellowship with other believers.
Absolutely.
That's where I land.
But,
Straight up here, what you're saying about the Sabbath day is interesting. I mean, I'd love to have a substantive conversation with you about the nature of God's rest and ours.
Well, yes, but and look, I will fully admit that I am justifying not going to church by.
Sure you are. But actually, as long as you don't justify not being the church.
No, absolutely.
And so here's what I say to people when they say, I don't want to go because God doesn't need me there and he's busy on a Sunday and that kind of thing. In fact, my grandfather used to say that to my grandmother. She used to pray 3 hours a day, every day. And he was a Ukrainian guy and she was a Ukrainian girl. And he would speak to her in this slang Ukrainian, laced with all kinds of profanity. And he'd say, don't you think that 3 hours, you're going to talk to God for 3 hours? Don't you think he's got better things to do than listen to you? And she said, yeah. Book, God first. Anyway. The point is that the goal is not to invite people to an institution or not to invite people to a particular mode or expression of doing this. The goal is to encounter with the power of God. Sure. And so I wrote the Healing Prayer book because of that very thing. My wife was dramatically healed of muscular dystrophy. And it happened when we gave up all hope. And it was this incredible kind of thing. So I had made a commitment to help Uganda in the north rebuild after the madness of Joseph Kony and Idi Amin. And so my congregation I was in Canada. There were two American congregations in my denomination that were asking my church to partner with them to go and help. And
Sure.
we would go there, and you know this, they had no education for 20 years.
Sure.
And so the person who could read wound up being on the town council or the mayor or something. Or they would become the pastor in the church or something, even in the school teacher, even though they didn't have much. And so they had to rebuild from scratch because they had not had anything. And some of them in that area that I went to, a place called Arua, I met people whose arms were cut off and whose tongues were cut out and whose nose was gone because Coney had done that to them. Horrible, nasty.
Yeah, that's terrible.
So we felt, my church felt commanded to try and help them. And so I went 3 years to the north and 1 year to Kampala, but regardless, the 3 years in the north were the defining ones. And we would take teams with us and we would do build projects in that place. So that epic journey really was astonishing.
Absolutely.
That one was. Here's what happened. I wound up meeting these guys in Atlanta, and this pastor said, David, would you come and help us? And so I went back to my church, and they said, yes, we'll help you. And they've committed initially $5,000 to pay for my way there to see if I could participate and so on. And in the course of time, by the time we made the commitment, we put $500,000 into that.
Wow.
Over about 3 years. And it was a lot of money, and it was a very generous, other-centered congregation. But you know what? The elders looked at me one day and they said, that's a lot of money.
Yeah.
I said, yeah. So can we meet the guy who's organized this? And so that pastor came to my church, and I was kind of scared because he was an African tribal who barked orders at people. He was a great leader in Africa, but trying to do, he's one of these guys who expects if you're not shining his shoes and pay attention to every word he says, he doesn't like the way you're going at things. And anyway, it was this crazy culture clash kind of thing.
Sure.
But and so I said, listen, guys, do you really want me to bring this guy in? He's going to insult our women. He's going to treat them like they're nothing. And he's going to just be loud and obnoxious. And they said to me, would he shake us up? I said, oh, yeah, he'd do that. They said, Pastor, invite him. I said, well, what am I going to do if he says something really odd in the congregation? They said, 3 Sundays in a row before he comes, you tell the congregation what Tribal Society Africa operates like. And ask him to forgive him, and then ask him for his leadership principles, because he was organizing 1,000 pastors to learn. That's what he was doing. And I was going over there to teach. And actually, this one that I wrote called Power Praying, I wrote this because I wanted a training manual for the Ugandans.
Sure.
So that's how I started writing. Anyway, I wrote this, and this is an examination of each of the key words of the Lord's Prayer, and I was giving that to them by way of curriculum. Anyway, the bottom line was, this guy comes to my church. And, he was telling these amazing stories about deliverance from death when somebody was praying in the night. It was like listening to one of those World War II stories where a grandmother would wake up and she'd pray for her grandson, and the grandson would have the bullet miss him. That kind of stuff was good.
Sure.
So he's telling these stories. And of course, my congregation is absolutely enthralled with the guy. And we had 3 services. We had a Saturday night, we had a Sunday morning at 9 and Sunday at 11. And here's what happened. The Saturday night was heard him. And they said, tell different stories tomorrow. We're coming back. And they texted their friends, right? So the whole congregation on Saturday night shows up Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, which was the kind of conservative crowd,
Sure.
And Saturday nighters were the easygoing kind of swing kind of guys. So
sure.
They were all mixed together, and it was an odd thing. And then those 9 o'clockers were so amazed by the stories he was telling about these miraculous things that happened. They all pushed into the 11 o'clock. And so we have this huge oversized assembly at 11 o'clock. And I am sitting on the step next to the platform, to the pulpit, because there was no chairs left. People were up and down the rows, down the hallway. And my wife was sitting there, and my wife had muscular dystrophy. The kind that she had is the same kind that the founder of Lululemon has right now. So he's just donated $100 million to FSH muscular dystrophy research. That's the kind. It's called fascioscapulohumeral.
Okay.
It starts in your head, goes down into your face, makes your neck kind of bad. Your shoulders hunch over, your shoulder blades go out of position. You have trouble with your legs being able to lift them for steps. And over the course of time, you discover you can't do steps.
Right.
Your muscles hollow out in the center.
Sure.
And he's now beginning to manifest some of the traits that my wife had. Now, my wife, her sister, her mother, and now her niece had this affliction. She couldn't lift her arms higher than her shoulders. Here's what happens. I am in the church. I am looking at my wife in this huge crowd of, I don't know how many hundreds of people. The capacity for the sanctuary was 450. And I think the number was 650 because we had overflow into the back part.
Sure.
So here's what happens. This guy gets up and he's got a thick accent. Everybody's straining to listen to him. And I don't want to make fun of the accent, but I'll try and give you an appreciation for it. So he turns and looks at me sitting next to him, and he says, David, what is M.A.? I thought, M.A. Master of Arts? I don't know.
Yeah.
No, I got something.
I mean, my mother, I don't know.
Yeah, no, so he puts his head in the pulpit and he waits, and there's this big crowd of people. He was in the middle of a war story. He
Right.
stopped the war story to ask the question. And then he looks up about a minute later and he says this: it's a wasting muscle disease. It starts in your head. It goes down into your shoulders. Your shoulder blades go out of position. Between 16 and 20, you start to get chronic pain. You get scoliosis in your spine. You start having trouble being able to walk. If you damage a muscle, you lose it forever. And he gave a perfect medical description of FSH, muscular dystrophy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I am looking at my wife in the congregation, and I am observing her as he's telling this story.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says this: whoever has this, Jesus has just healed you. And her arms went above her head for the first time in decades.
Wow.
And everybody who knew us, and we've been in that church at that point 5 years,
Yeah.
looked at her, and our jaws are all dropping. Now, I have all 3 of my congregations watching that. And so we go to our home, and we have guests in our home because they traveled to see whether or not they were going to get involved in the work project over in New Ghana.
Right.
They come to hear the guy. And the plan was that I would get up on the top shelves and take down the heavy pots and pans that she would use to cook the lunch.
Definitely.
And then she would do this, and she could lift her arms this high, and she could do that if I gave her room, that kind of thing.
Right.
She pushes me out of the way. She stands on the step, and she starts taking down heavy pots and pans.
Wow. That's epic.
Oh, my heavens, was that epic. It was just this incredible kind of a thing. And of course, there were people who had known her who just could not bring themselves to believe this. Our doctor had been our doctor for 5 years. We were going to the same one from the time that we arrived in that town. He waited 3 years before he wrote the note. But after 3 years, I have the medical note. I can send it to you, Xander. He wrote me the note, and he said, this is medically impossible. All traces of FSH muscular dystrophy have vanished from this girl's body. And it was 3 years later that he wrote it.
Right.
So,
wow.
So that is one of the reasons why I wrote the Healing Prayer book.
Definitely.
I wanted people to know that Jesus is still in the healing ministry today. And oh, by the way, he doesn't care if you're a Baptist or a Pentecostal or an Anglican or somebody jaded who got, fed up with church and left. He doesn't care. What he cares about is that you engage with him, that you talk with him, that you love on him. So when you were talking about how you don't want people to invite you to that church, well, that's not my issue. My issue is, are you going to don't write off Jesus because church is bad. Well, actually examine the scripture to find out what church can do to improve.
Definitely.
That's what I say to people. Yeah, I would.
Definitely.
I would just say, what would you find in the scripture? So I mean, there's other stories in that book that are just as epic as that one. That one impacts me personally. And I have the medical doctor's note after, and it was an 8-year project. He knew us 5 years before and 3 years after before he wrote that.
Wow. Well, that is an incredibly epic story. And I am happy that your wife is doing better. And
yeah, well, better is not the word.
All right, well, fine.
No, listen. So one of the things I say in that book is that ordinary healing is miraculous too. And I'll tell you why I said it. Because before, when she damaged a muscle, it would never heal.
Sure.
After she was healed, she would damage a muscle because she slept on it funny, or she pulled something, she was whatever, and it would heal, it would recover. And when I watched the muscles recover, that's when I knew that she was healed.
Sure.
It wasn't just a one-off. It was now the ordinary means by which people live has been restored to her. So I regard natural healing as miraculous just as much as the rest.
Absolutely. Well, that is incredible. Somehow our time is up here, David.
Okay, well, we could do this again if you want to.
Absolutely. We'll absolutely. I mean, I'm sure there's, in the, I don't know, you're up in Canada, so I don't know if you ever heard of a guy named Fred Rogers who had a children's television show.
Oh, sure. I love the movie, by the way. With the Tom
really,
Hanks. Yeah. People told me I was supposed to dress like him because I'm a pastor.
Well, I mean, he
So I put
was,
the
I
sweater
believe,
on, see?
I mean, he did his whole show because he was, and I'm not going to remember what denomination, but it was part of his
He was Presbyterian, yes.
Presbyterian. It was part of his like work to get his doctorate or whatever. So anyway, one of the things I love Fred Rogers. I thought what he was sharing was great, but this is very appropriate to say what Fred Rogers would say is, we'll have more things to talk about. I will, and so will you.
He would say
So
that.
he
He start by
would,
saying,
and
welcome to the neighborhood. Yes, he always.
exactly. So we clearly have more things to say, David. So in the future, perhaps you come back and there are more exciting stories to share.
Well, I wanted to tell you more healing prayer stories because that's why I wanted to get on this interview. The book is new. It's just been put up by Whitaker House.
Okay.
And
Well, well, let's see what we can do
okay.
to get you back on. Very interesting. And I just want to remind all of my listeners that if you want help starting your epic journey, if you go to epicbegins.com and you go over to my courses and you put in Epic Begins as a code, you'll get $50 off the price of the course. It's a home study course. And, if there's anything I can do to help you on your epic journey, you can reach out at epicbegins.com to get a hold of me. David, I want to thank you so much for being my guest. Super fascinating. There is more to be said. And I'll remind everybody that epic choices lead to the epic life that you want to lead.
Get your gift copy of the award-winning book, Epic Begins with One Step Forward, at epicbegins.com. That's a wrap on this episode of Epic Begins with One Step Forward with your host, Xander Sprague, best-selling author, internationally acclaimed public speaker, and licensed professional clinical counselor. To make your next conference or event epic, send an email to Xander at zander@epicbegins.com. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. Remember, epic choices, epic life.